deliver your doctoral inaugural lecture.
Thank you. Well, thank you for coming and hopefully listening for the full 20 minutes, hopefully. Today I'm going to share with you some of the findings that emerged from my PhD project, which explored the career histories and professional aspirations of women deputy head teachers. And these are working in secondary schools, but state-funded secondary schools across England. But before I get into the aims and the methodology and all the nitty-gritty, I'd like to tell you a story, if that's okay. Ex-English teacher, I like a good story, so hopefully you'll enjoy that too. So this is Sharon, a pseudonym, and she didn't look anything like this as well, so that's always good to know. And she was a deputy head teacher in a large secondary academy school in the Midlands of England at the time of interview. And when I went to talk to her, she was talking about her professional future and she was making plans for her professional future. So one option that was open to Sharon was headship. And she gave me lots of logical reasons why headship was a good option for her. So she had the skills and the experience. She had experience stepping up to that head teacher role in the head teacher's absence. And she also realised the value of a good head teacher when it comes to improving students' life chances, especially in challenging environments or low-income communities as well. But when she thought about applying and aspiring, actually she was filled with anxiety and a bit of dread. And for me, this sort of really sums up the anxiety because it's full of red and you've got these sort of danger warning signs. And she was sort of confronted with this anxiety, so she wondered what would happen if Ofsted came in and judged her school to be inadequate and she may lose her job. That could ruin her both professionally and personally. She contemplated the additional responsibility, the stress, the workload, and she was clear that she didn't want her health and her relationships outside of school to be adversely affected by her job. But most importantly, she thought that headship would take her away from the people that she joined the teaching profession to help in the first place, and that was her students, young people. So she thought, right, okay, I might stay as a deputy head teacher. But she was quite concerned about her shelf life as a deputy head teacher. Would she be able to continue to have impact, or would she stagnate? She wondered about what this might look like to her superiors, so a current head teacher or future employers. Would it look like she doesn't have the ambition or the drive? And therefore, would they question her commitment to the role itself? So really, Sharon was caught in this kind of head versus heart battle. And throughout her narrative, she talked about her career as being a journey. But it was also littered with this phrase, I don't know what to do, I don't know what to do. And right at the end, she said, there's this destination, i.e. headship. I can touch it, it's almost mine. There was a definite space, a post there, almost with her name on it. But I don't know that I want to be at that destination. So she was really sort of caught in this kind of dilemma, really. So Sharon was one of 12 women that I interviewed as part of this research. And what I was interested in was their career history, so their past, but also their professional aspirations, how they envisaged their future panning out. And it really aimed to explore the ways in which these women, as potential aspirants to headship, perceived the secondary head teacher role. Was it a viable option for them? What did it look like? And really, sort of how this past, present and future came together for each individual participant in the research. So why bother? Well, that's a good question. And at the end I was quite asking myself that question. But really, one of the main rationales for this project focused on the persistent underrepresentation of women in secondary headship. So women continue to be underrepresented in sort of key decision-making roles in our society, and educational leadership is one such area. And what I've popped on the slide is just the national picture. And interesting, the Leicestershire picture is even worse, which I think is really quite interesting. So approximately 38% of women nationally are head teachers, which is an interesting question. So why is this? What does the literature tell us? Well, there's lots of reasons that are pointed out in the literature, so one of them being childcare, domestic responsibilities, cultural expectations and discrimination. There's also literature around women's self-perceptions, preferences and choices. But the literature also tells us lots and lots of things that help women progress in their careers. So you've got networking, mentors and role models, a sense of vocation and social justice, so helping students progress, but also various leadership development programs and opportunities that are out there as well. Okay. Another rationale for this piece of work was just noting how little deputy head teachers feature in this literature. Compared to their head teacher colleagues, they really do get forgotten. Hence what I think are forget-me-nots, but if anyone's a keen gardener, please contradict me. But they've been called neglected actors and forgotten leaders. But what's interesting, when you look at the data and you pull it apart from the Department for Education, at that deputy head teacher level, it's actually quite equitable. So there's something going on with deputy head teachers. And I sort of wanted to know really whether they were confronting structural barriers or obstacles, or whether they were making active choice to stay in a job they actually really enjoyed. So about the time I handed in my PhD thesis, this came out, which was typical really, because it was quite interesting. But this found that just over a third of their deputy head and assistant head and vice principals aspired towards headship, which doesn't sound like a lot really. And they gave lots and lots of reasons why this might be. So they blamed inspection, risk and a culture of blame, lots of workload, lots of stress, lots of accountability, and so forth. And what's really interesting about this report is when they asked people, okay, so what would encourage you to step up to headship? They said, okay, no inspection in the first year, just no Ofsted inspections. And that would have been it. So it's really sort of an interesting finding, I thought, which linked to this research. So in terms of my research questions then, there were 4. As I've sort of mentioned already, I was interested in how individual deputies made sense of their career histories, experienced deputy headships of the current role they're in, perceived secondary headship, and then envisaged their professional futures. This is the boring bit, which I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about really, just that I took a qualitative approach to research, and it was an interpretive phenomenological analysis methodology which informed my data collection and my data analysis, and this culminated in a sample of 12 women deputy heads who were, in inverted commas, a homogenous group. Given the time constraints, time pressures, all the rest of it that these deputies faced, I offered both face-to-face interviews and telephone, which had interesting methodological consequences, because one of them was marking as I was interviewing us, which was really interesting, which again says something about time, load and pressure. Right, so lots of data on here, so I'm not going to go into all of it, but just give you the headline facts about these women. So I've already told you about Sharon, but how about everybody else? Well, the 12 women that I interviewed were aged between 35 and 56. And they were all held deputy head teacher or vice principal positions in either academy or local authority schools in England at the time of interview. They were located across the country, so North, Midlands and South. 7 of them had children, and they had between 6 months and 11 years worth of deputy experience. But the key thing here is that 8 of them aspired towards headship and could articulate that that was what they wanted to do. 3 were unsure and 1 completely rejected the possibility. So in terms of findings then, which I think is the bit we're going to concentrate on, there are 4 areas really that I wanted to talk about today, and they focus on time, complexity, emotion, and then sort of heterogeneity or differences between individual participants. The first one I've already touched on, actually, in terms of the women themselves. When I interviewed them, they really saw the value of spending time on this decision, because they realised it had enormous professional and personal consequences, and they acknowledged that sort of careful reflection requires time. However, every one of the women I interviewed talked about multiple and conflicting responsibilities, working at home, working after school, sort of really not being able to keep up with the pace of their workload, etc., and just never having enough time or being time poor, which is a phrase that came out of the data quite a lot. there were several repercussions of this that came out. So there was concerns about health, both physical and mental health. But one of the things related to career decision making that came out was there just isn't enough time to formulate a career plan. There isn't enough time to actually reflect on careers and sort of focus on your own development. And this is a quotation from Dawn, one of the women I interviewed. And she talks about ticking off things on a to-do list, this sort of busyness, but just forgetting the bigger picture, i.e. where she might be next year, 5 years, 10 years down the line. Next sort of finding I think might be of relevance to career decision making is that there are lots of individual factors, individual social and contextual factors, and these are both distinct but also interrelated in the data. And the four that really came out, the first one, values. So the women talked about their values helping them to prioritise and move forward and really sort of hone in on what was important in life. And when I asked them about headship, they talked about using their values to work out, is that role compatible with who I am and what I believe about education? The second, about future self, although they realised that the unexpected happens, they can't plan for everything, they did recognise the importance of thinking about who they wanted to be in the future and where they wanted to be. And sometimes this future self took on a different persona. It was almost a different person that they were trying to be, which was quite interesting. There was lots of talk about personal and professional communities, role models, mentors, coaches that had been helpful in helping them to work out which route is the best one to go down, but also the importance of support from friends and family. And one of the things that I found quite interesting was the idea that people outside of education, those people that weren't consumed by the sort of weird world in which we work, were able to give quite a lot of perspective on career decision making. And lastly, the bigger picture, the Ofsted picture, the policy changes, the accountability measures, etc. And these really played a big part in their career decision making. And as one participant explained, or sort of looked quite worried when she said, "I've got a mortgage to pay, I don't want to walk into school one day and not have a job," which I think is both sad but also interesting in relation to this research. So one way of thinking about these factors is this diagram. So you can see them all sort of overlapping, but framed in this kind of national policy climate. So educational policy sort of framing everything. But right at the heart is that individual who's charged with making a decision and being quite agentic and sort of deciding for themselves where they wanted to go. So there's a tension really between the structure but also agency of the individual. One of the last things I found was this idea of emotion. Now I think we tend to think of career decision making as being a purely logical exercise, something that we do with a tick chart and a nice sort of grid in front of us. But what really came out of the data was how emotionally charged this decision was. And there's lots of examples of just kind of emotional words really, so self-doubt, needing to know what feels right, things that are frightening, etc., etc. So I think that's a really sort of important finding. But what was really, really interesting, sorry I keep saying interesting, I do apologise, I think it's interesting anyway. What was interesting was that these women felt they were the only ones having these anxieties, and everybody else has got it sorted, everyone else has got it sussed. And they also talked about how they couldn't possibly talk about this sort of stuff within the school. So it was almost a taboo subject. Don't talk about your anxieties, don't talk about your career anxieties, because we're not allowed to have them. Everybody else has got it sorted, but I'm the one that hasn't quite got it sorted yet. And it made me wonder whether we need to normalise these, whether actually we need to make it a bit of a cultural shift and discuss people's career ambitions, but also discuss their sort of anxieties for the future. And the very last thing that I think is potentially interesting is the differences that emerge in the data. We talk about potential aspirants to headship. They're not all the same, they can't possibly be, we're all different. And they all saw their careers very differently. Now, through the lens of Margaret Archer's theory, which I haven't got time to go through at the moment, but if you want to talk to me about that later, that's fine. But I was able to find three different groups of potential aspirant. Now, before I go into these, they come with a health warning. I'm not saying that we all fit neatly into each category, or that we don't sort of flip between each category as we sort of move on in our careers, or that you can't possibly be living in a grey space between them. They're just a best fit sort of ideal typology, but was quite a useful lens to look through at the data and the women's career narratives. So quickly show you those three types then. So the first type that I found was a strategic and decisive potential aspirant to headship, of which there were 5 in the data. And the ones that matched this type most closely identified themselves very clearly as tomorrow's head teachers. They described prioritising their careers over their personal lives, and there was a very clear history of career planning right from the word go. And they really kind of approached their careers in a very strategic manner. So just a couple of examples from the data there. Okay, so you can see Sophie's talking about her personal life taking a back seat. Same with Dawn. And Alice talking about I was very clear. And she mentioned sort of having conversations with senior leaders about this is where I want to be, I know exactly who I want to be. The second group, very values oriented. Again, there were 5 of these, which is interesting. And these tended to aspire towards headship or be quite unsure about it. And these women saw teaching as a vocation and saw self-fulfillment as being achieved through making a difference to students' lives. They didn't perceive their careers in monetary terms, but rather, a sort of mission almost to work to a more democratic and socially just way of working and way of being in education. So some examples here from Naomi and Catherine. I don't know how I'm doing for time, so I'll just sort of get on in a minute. But you can see here there's a lot about vision, a lot about ethos, about being child-sensitive and so forth. And the last group were the ones that had either rejected the possibility of headship or were very, very uncertain. And these are people that I classified as person-centred. They were very much relation-oriented, uncertain about or had rejected the possibility of headship, as I've said. But their friends and family were their ultimate concern, as were their colleagues and the people they work with. They weren't interested in status, power or money, and generally just wanted what one of them termed stability, okay, which I think was quite interesting. Some examples here. Faye talking about her relationships primarily, and Sharon talking about sort of communicating with husband at home about whether to apply for headship or not. So very quickly then, what are my implications, the so what question, I guess. Well, the first implication here is that there are differences between potential aspirants to headship. We're not all the same, we've got different priorities, different motivations, different aspirations. And that, for me, questions the value of one-size-fits-all leadership development programmes, routes into headship or routes that are designed to encourage more women into headship, and whether really what we need is a more sort of bespoke way of dealing with this. So considering how individual deputies can be best supported in their career planning. I think relation to time, one implication is we need more time, mental space to formulate career plans. But the big one for me is this idea about talking about normalising and sort of addressing anxieties and the emotional aspects of all of this. If you choose to step up, you choose to lead a school, you're very public, you're very exposed, and I think it's just being aware of the emotional aspects of that, really. So that's my research in a nutshell. If you want to follow up on any of that, you can in these 2 areas, but the biggest thing on the slide is a big thank you to Joan, my supervisor, who offered lots of guidance, lots of support, and I doubt very much I'd have finished without her, so I wanted to say thank you very much. Thank you.
Very interesting lecture. Any questions?